Hello, I'm Robin Wilson of Gin Blossoms, and you are listening to my weekly mixtape with Brian Colbert. Rock away.
Welcome to My Weekly Mixtape, a podcast that takes the classic mixtape approach to building a modern playlist. I'm your host, Brian Colburn. Tonight, I'm super excited to welcome a singer-songwriter who I hold a great deal of respect for, as many of his songs are part of the soundtrack to my high school and college years, and that would be the one and only Robin Wilson of the Gin Blossoms. Robin, thank you so much for joining me, man.
Thank you for having me, Brian. Good day to you.
And right back at you, my friend. And I'd like to start by asking you the question I ask all of my first-time guests, and that is, what does the word mixtape mean to you?
Well, for me, literally, it means a tape, a cassette tape that I would put into the tape deck and then record individual songs from my record collection. And I always took it as a sort of art form and wanted the songs to flow really well from one to the next or retain some sort of sonic theme, you know, like all guitar bands or all metal or just, songs that I would listen to a song and then I would think, oh, it'd be great right after this. And I would pull something else out of my record collection. And then, of course, I would always give my mixtapes like a really pretentious name, like the dawning of time or whatever, I'd give some silly, pretentious, poetic name to my mixtapes. And then, of course, if you were trying to impress a girl, you would make a mixtape for her, songs you kind of wanted this new girl that you were trying to impress, what songs you wanted her to hear and to think of you when she hears them. So, I have a long history with the mixtape. And now, of course, we do it on our phones and there's no tape anymore, but it holds a special place in my heart. And then also, in addition to that, a few years ago, I went to see the New Kids on the Block mixtape tour.
Yes.
And that was very cool, where the New Kids were performing with Rick Astley, En Vogue, and Salt and Pepper. And it was a great, great time, a really fun concert. So, mixtape, go back to the 80s and actually make a tape of various songs, various artists, and put them on a cassette.
Well, to start talking about the Gin Blossoms, I am going to start in the 80s because I want to talk about your debut album, Dusted, which was released on an indie label, both on LP and cassette in 1989. 4 of the songs from that album would become future staples on the band's major label debut, 1992's New Miserable Experience, with those tracks being Hey Jealousy, Found Out About You, Cajun Song, and the album opener, in both instances, Lost Horizons. Can you talk about the evolution that those songs took from the indie label renditions to the versions that most people recognize as heard on New Miserable Experience?
Sure. Well, the biggest difference is the tempo. We had no discipline when we recorded Dusted. We were doing it for a very small budget. We didn't have a lot of time. And so we just kind of stormed through the songs, more or less playing them live. And then, of course, when the record came out, we were all like, God, everything sounds so fast. Why didn't we think to slow everything down a little bit? So by the time we actually got around to recording New Miserable Experience a few years later, we had a bit more discipline, and we learned to experiment with the tempos to see what was the best vibe. And aside from the tempos, the only other thing that really would have changed is that we changed the bridge on Lost Horizons. There had been an earlier version of that song that Doug had done. Doug was our founding guitar player and songwriter. He had that song for a few years before he formed Gin Blossoms, and they had a slightly different version of the bridge. And when we were recording New Miserable Experience, we decided to experiment with the original format of the bridge, and it worked out really well. So that's what you ended up hearing on the on the record, but we had never played it live with exactly that arrangement until we made New Miserable Experience, and then we had to sort of relearn the song, so we were doing the same arrangement as on the record. So mostly I would say the big difference between those two records is our discipline and our tempos.
Well, the original 92 release of New Miserable Experience features an Arizona-themed artwork. But after Hey Jealousy took off and the label re-released the album in 93, it features the artwork that most folks are familiar with today. And that was something you personally took artistic control over. Am I not mistaken?
No, you are correct. We really didn't like the first version of the album cover. We were really upset about it. And, we had given them a few ideas for what we wanted. And, they didn't really want to spend a lot of money. So they kind of slapped something together. We thought it was terrible. And I remember getting into something of an argument with our product manager at the label and explained to her that we hate the cover. We don't want this cover. And she kept trying to say, well, you really don't understand marketing and you need to see this from our point of view. And it was really, really an insulting conversation. And I remember saying to her, are you telling me that we've worked our whole lives to make this record and it's going to come out with a cover that we all hate and there's nothing we can do about it? And she just said, well, you really don't understand marketing. And I was so pissed off, because I had been a lifelong fan of rock music. I had been drawing album covers since I was a little kid. I had experience in record retail. I worked at 3 different record stores through the 1980s. And so I was as immersed in album cover artwork as any fan anywhere. And so to be told by the label, well, you just don't understand marketing. And I was just like, I was like, fuck you. It's our album. We know what we want. And so several months after that, when the label decided to relaunch the record, I got into a fight with her again. And I said, no, we're going to stick this out. You told me that I didn't know anything about marketing. And now you're telling me you want to redo the album, the way I was saying in the first place. And, you made it such a miserable experience to put the album cover together. So I said, no, we're going to keep the album. And she said, well, Robin, we really want you to just kind of relax and we're going to redo it. So, and I said, okay, well, if we are going to redo the album cover, you're going to do what I want and what we want as a band. And so for the relaunched version of the album cover, I basically had almost full control over it. I did the layouts. I turned in the photographs. I hand wrote all the lyrics and the credits. And I constructed a prototype. And we ended up they followed my advice and we did the album cover that I really wanted to do, based on my bandmates and myself ideas and our input. So all of those photographs on that cover are pictures that I personally took, and I still have all the negatives for all that stuff.
Well, while we're talking about photographs, I actually want to bring up another photograph because one of my favorite songs from New Miserable Experience is Allison Road. And the song was based off of a photograph that you took off of Interstate 10 in Roosevelt, Texas. I'm really curious because back in the 90s, we didn't have digital cameras to take endless photos. So there must have been something significant about this road sign that made you want to capture that moment.
Yes. Well, and it actually wasn't me. It was a friend of ours who had followed us out to Austin. We were performing at South by Southwest, and a couple carloads full of our friends followed us out there. And in one of those cars was a guy who had a sister named Allison. And when they passed this street sign that said Allison Road, my friend took a photograph of the street sign. And again, you're right, this wasn't digital cameras. So it was some weeks later that the photos got developed. And for whatever reason, the hard copy of the photograph of the Allison Road street sign, somehow it ended up in my apartment. And I remember stumbling across this photograph and seeing the sign. It said, "Exit here, Allison Road." And immediately in my head, I started like singing the chorus to the song. Like the song hit me immediately. And I kind of knew from that moment, like what the song was, what the lyrical structure should be, what the melody was. And I had just immediately started writing. And within 20 minutes, basically the whole song was done. And it was the first song that I had turned in as a songwriter in Jim Blossoms. It was the first song that I turned in that the band really liked and was excited to perform. Up to that point, the songs of mine we were doing, they were just kind of throwing me a bone. But, you know, especially Doug really didn't like playing my songs. And I had joined the band as the least experienced member. Jim Blossoms was my first real band. I had only ever done like jam sessions and open mic nights and things like that. So they looked at me as like a junior member, and they really didn't want to do my songs. But when I turned in Allison Road, it became clear to everyone that I had the potential to write hits as well. And it was the first time I really got any respect as a songwriter in the band. And, you know, everyone around us, from our close friends and other groups to my younger brother, when they heard the song, they were all like, "Wow, Robin can write too. Go figure." And so as a songwriter, you know, it was a great accomplishment. It was a coming of age moment for me. There was a review that came out once that said that Allison Road was the best Tom Petty song that Tom Petty never wrote. I was always so proud of that. And then a couple of years back, we actually had an event in our hometown of Tempe where they renamed a street in our hometown. They renamed it Allison Road. And we received that honor. And now I've got one of the street signs hanging up in my kitchen in New York. So, you know, I'm perhaps the only songwriter from Arizona to have a street named after one of their songs. So it's a great accomplishment and a very proud moment for me.
Well, I want to touch on that Arizona music scene for a moment, because one of my favorite aspects of the Jim Blossoms music is the band's ability to weave different styles and influences into tracks across your albums. And I'll use the earlier mentioned Cajun song to the country-leaning Cheatin' at the end of New Miserable Experience, as well as the Americana Memphis Time, both of which, those last two songs, saw significant airplay on my country radio show on 90.3 WMSC in the mid to late 90s.
Cool.
Were those influences that were woven through the tracks a nod to the eclectic music scene in Tempe, Arizona, where the band had their beginnings?
Well, we didn't really overthink things. We didn't ever have a discussion where we would say, let's try to sound like, you know, this band that's happening right now or whatever, you know. But we were very much into bands like The Replacements and Cheap Trick. And we wanted to be a fun, upbeat, raucous rock and roll band. And so we were always just kind of chasing that without really overthinking it. There was a moment where Doug and I had a conversation about what should be our first single. And I remember saying to Doug, we should write like a rock and roll song, like a Cheap Trick song. And Doug took that bit of information and came up with the riff and the first bit of lyrics for Hold Me Down. And then he gave that to me, and I helped him finish the song, came up with the intro and the bridge, and finished the lyrics. Doug had written about half of the lyrics, maybe a little more than half of the lyrics, but it was up to me to write a couple of verses and help him figure out, like how the melody landed over the chords. But that was one of the few times where, the only time I can think of where we specifically referenced another band when we were writing a song. And that was my saying to Doug, we should write something like a Cheap Trick song, something kind of upbeat and fast, and in my head, I was thinking like On Top of the World or Surrender or He's a Whore, those kind of Cheap Trick songs. And what Doug and I ended up writing was Hold Me Down, which has a much darker tone than a typical Cheap Trick song. But that was a really proud moment for me. And to this day, I really enjoy performing Hold Me Down.
In the 90s, people talk about the Seattle music scene for grunge. They talk about the Orange County music scene for ska punk music. But Tempe, Arizona had a sound of its own with groups like the Gin Blossoms, the Meat Puppets, and the Refreshments. Could you talk about the music scene that was happening in Arizona in the 90s and how significant it was?
Well, sure. Well, all of us, for the most part, were starting our bands back in the 80s. So we were more a product of that time than anything else. And I mentioned the Replacements, but there were also groups like, say, The Church and REM that were guitar-based rock bands, very melodic. And I always felt that we were a lot like The Church. I think they had a really big influence on Doug and our bass player, Bill. And we were really, we were looking at bands like, specifically like REM and the Replacements and wanting to emulate what those groups had done. So our scene in Tempe, there were dozens and dozens of bands. It was a big college town, so there were plenty of clubs to play. And musically, it was just sort of independent of what was happening in other scenes. At the time, the big music scenes were Minneapolis, Austin, Texas, Seattle, Los Angeles. And we weren't a part of any of that. And we were just kind of following our own muse. And, I think looking back, groups like, say, the Eagles really strongly influenced the direction of the songwriting of bands in Arizona. But if you had asked us at the time, we were all really trying to be more like REM,
Got it. Well, I am a huge sucker for cover songs, and one of my favorite tribute albums that came out in the 90s was the 1994 compilation Kiss My Ass, Classic KISS Regrooved, which featured both you and this summer's touring mates for you, Toad the Wet Sprocket, reworking songs from the KISS catalog, with Toad taking on Rock and Roll All Night and Gin Blossoms covering Christine 16. Did the band have complete artistic freedom to take that song where you wanted to go with it creatively, or was somebody from the KISS camp kind of involved in that entire process?
Actually, they were encouraging us to do whatever we wanted. And I think that's why you got that amazing version of Rock and Roll All Night by Toad the Wet Sprocket, which is just so completely different than the original. With our take on Christine 16, we really didn't do anything all that different. We just wanted to do a spirited rendition of the song. And I was really the only big KISS fan in Gin Blossom. So if it hadn't have been for my enthusiasm, the band probably would have turned it down.
Whoa.
Because Jesse and Bill weren't particularly KISS fans. But for me, they were my first favorite band. That was the first concert I ever saw, was Cheap Trick and KISS in 1977. And they were a huge influence and inspiration to me. So when we were offered that, I flipped out and I was super excited. And my bandmates were like, well, what are we going to, what can we do? We really don't know their songs. And so I went through the catalog and picked a song that I felt like my bandmates could stomach and would be able to perform well, was sort of more in our wheelhouse. certainly Christine 16 is more of like a straight pop rock song than say something like God of Thunder. So, I purposely looked for something that I thought that they would enjoy playing. And so that's why we came up with Christine 16. And as I said, we didn't really try to reinvent it. We just set out to do a nice, competent version of it. So that was very exciting for me. I got to spend a day in the studio with Gene and Paul when we were mixing the song. And so I got to spend a whole day just hanging out with them and listening to them tell, stories. And I peppered them with every question I ever would have wanted to ask KISS. And, I got them to autograph my lunchbox and my best friend's copy of Love Gun, which to this day, my best friend has framed in his office. And, it was a big deal for me to get to hang out with KISS and to be in the studio with them as a peer, as someone that they had some respect for. And then it was just a few weeks after that we were asked to join them and perform with them on Letterman. And so you can find it on YouTube if you search for KISS Gin Blossoms. You can see our performance where basically I got to front KISS on Letterman. And this was literally my 6th grade dream come true. So, I hold that up as one of the great moments of our career.
Well, this summer is the 30th anniversary of that KISS tribute, and you and Toad the Wet Sprocket are going to be on the road this summer together. Is there any chance you guys revisit these KISS songs in celebration?
That's a great idea, but no, that ain't gonna happen. But we are learning an REM song.
Oh, nice.
So we're planning to perform together on an REM song, and then also we're probably going to learn a song by the Byrds, and we will hopefully be doing that as part of the encore on most nights on the tour.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Well, after the huge success of New Miserable Experience, the band is now tasked with writing the main song for Empire Records, which is a beloved movie for anybody that is around my age. It feels like it was one of our coming-of-age movies in the 90s. And as somebody who worked in a record store for as long as you did, I have to ask, did Empire Records get it right?
In a lot of ways, yeah. It was exciting to be asked to be part of that movie because our bass player Bill, and I both worked together at Tower Records. Working at record stores was a big part of my youth and my 80s experience. My life in the 80s was like a John Hughes movie, and working at the record store was a big part of my identity. So when our band took off and suddenly we had the lead single for the soundtrack for a movie about working in a record store, I thought that was kind of cool poetry and symmetry to the way things worked out. And honestly, working at Tower Records was a little more chaotic than the Empire Records movie. Of course, they have to take artistic license and dramatize things. So they played up certain aspects of working in a record store, but they didn't really get the level of sort of chaos and disorganization. And, it didn't really capture for me the how important the music itself was to being an employee at a record store. We were immersed in music all the time. We were hearing every single record that came out, all different genres. And one of my favorite things about working in the record store is when someone would come in and say, well, what do you suggest? What do you recommend? What's good right now? And then you could just ask them one or two questions. Well, what was the last record that you bought? Did you like it? Or, what groups do you like listening to? And then being able to take them around the store and say, well, if you like that, then you're really going to like this new Joe Jackson album. Or, if you like Skinny Puppy, then you're really going to like Ministry. or whatever, Sisters of Mercy, whatever it is. Recommending music to people was my favorite part of working at the record store, being surrounded by the music all of the time. And then because we knew all the reps from the record companies, we were constantly getting free concert tickets. So, you'd be working at the record store and then you'd go home and you'd listen to music all night, or you'd go to a concert. That's all we did, was listen to music, play records, make mixtapes. We was constantly seeing local bands and participating in open mic nights and, just dreaming about starting a band. And that was our obsession. All of my friends, that's all we wanted to do was play music and go to shows and hear the latest records. And that's all we did. And I think that's how you become a musician, or at least like a rock and roll musician, is you immerse yourself in it, and it feeds into your songwriting and performances. And I'm just so grateful that I ended up in the right band and that we all had the ability to write decent songs, because that's what it always comes down to, having good songs. So
agree.
And I'm not sure exactly what the last question was. I think I sort of just started rambling there, but
no, I think you hit the nail on the head. And I liken when I worked in a record store, when I tell my kids about my experience, I basically explain to them, I was the human algorithm. We didn't have Apple Music or Spotify to tell us what other songs.
Right.
You had to rely on other people's opinions and other people's knowledge. And the people that worked in record stores cared enough about music that they wanted to give you the right opinion, because that kept you coming back. When you were writing Till I Hear It From You for Empire Records, were you given any context of how the song was going to be utilized in the movie? Because you and co-writers Jesse Valenzuela and Marshall Crenshaw came up with the perfect fit for the movie. I'm curious, did you write that in tandem as the movie was being made, or did you see the scene and say, here's our idea?
No, we didn't write the song with anything specific in the movie in mind. Our goal was simply to write a good, catchy pop song. We weren't given any instructions other than go write a hit, go write something good. And so we really just set out to come up with a good song. And we knew that if it was a decent enough song, they'd be able to fit it in somehow into the album and into the movie. And we did know going in that it was going to be the main single from the soundtrack. So there was a good deal of pressure on us to make sure we delivered something really, really good. But that was pretty much our only instruction, was just go write something good.
Well, between 1992 and 1995, the band lived on a roller coaster with many ups and downs, including the massive success of New Miserable Experience, to the soundtrack and the compilations like we talked about, to the tragic loss of Doug Hopkins, and that's referenced in the album title, to 1996's Congratulations, I'm Sorry. Is it true that the lead single from that album, Follow You Down, came together at the tail end of the recording sessions?
Yes, it did. We were pretty much, we thought we were done with the record, but then the label came to us and said, you need to go write another hit single. And once again, they were very clear that it had to be a hit single. So it was a great deal of pressure on us because we knew the label was waiting for the record. They were waiting for one more song. And this was the first album we had made without our founding guitar player and songwriter, Doug Hopkins. So we were under a lot of pressure from ourselves to make sure we lived up to Doug's legacy and the quality of his music.
Mm-hmm.
So I look at the success of Follow You Down as perhaps our single greatest achievement, because you can never be under more pressure than that moment where you're following up a massively successful debut record with your second album, and then you add in the additional pressure of not having our founding songwriter, Doug Hopkins, to rely on. So now it was up to me and Jesse really to prove that we could write hits too. And I had already turned in a couple of songs that were hits, so I was fairly certain that we had it in us. But it was still a great deal of pressure to live up to. There was a huge backlash when we lost Doug, and especially back home in Tempe, people were really doubtful that we would be able to live up to Doug's legacy without him. And there was a lot of backlash and a lot of pressure. So it was a difficult time. It's hard to understate or overstate just how frightened we were, how terrifying it was to be in that position where we had to go write a hit. And then we turned in Follow You Down, and we knew that we had pulled it off, and the label was confident that we had pulled it off. And the song came out, and it went straight to the top of the charts. And it was a top 10 single, and we did it on Saturday Night Live. And it was a number one hit in a few different countries. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I look at it as perhaps our single greatest accomplishment as a band under such intense pressure. I'm very, very proud of us for Follow You Down.
Well, when I listen to Congratulations, I'm Sorry, the song Seventh Inning Stretch is simply the introduction to My Car for me. However, there's a music nerd part of me that always wants to dig a little deeper. And Seventh Inning Stretch, besides the fact that it's track 7 on the album, was recorded at the time the Arizona Diamondbacks were awarded their expansion franchise. Would that happen to have anything to do with the song being in that slot?
No. It just, we had a great keyboard player, Art Neville of the Neville Brothers, was there in the studio with us, because we actually were not only label mates with the Neville Brothers, we had toured with them a little bit, but we also had the same management, Bill Graham management out of San Francisco. They handled both Jim Blossoms and the Neville Brothers. So when we wanted to bring in a keyboard player, it made perfect sense to turn to the Neville Brothers. And I wasn't there that day, but I think, Jesse and Bill are both huge baseball fans. And to this day, if we're on tour and we have a day off, we often will go to a baseball game. At least once a summer, we'll end up at a minor league baseball game or a major league game, depending upon where our days off are. And so baseball, especially for Bill and Jesse, was something that they were really into. And again, I wasn't there that day, but I think they were just laughing and said, hey, play the Seventh Inning Stretch big. And then for whatever reason, we decided to mix it into the record. So again, we didn't really overthink things like that. We just did what entertained us.
Awesome. Well, I guess my conspiracy theory will have to rest then. But I want to fast forward to 2006 when the band released Major Lodge Victory, which featured amazing Jim Blossom tracks like Learning the Hard Way, The End of the World, and Come On Hard. Thankfully, I own a CD copy of this because that's just ingrained in my DNA for 46 years. But it's currently not available on streaming. Is that something that's out of your hands? Because it's a great album.
Is. Thank you. Yeah, thanks. No, it's not available through streaming because there was we worked with the independent label, and that label went under, and then it was somehow purchased by some kind of investment company, and then that company went under. And so the rights to that album are just kind of lost. And so nobody knows who exactly, or at least none of us know exactly who owns the rights to that album. And so it's out of print, and I don't even have a copy of it. If I actually wanted to hear it, I would have to go on YouTube, and someone has uploaded it to YouTube, and that's, as far as I know, the only place you can really hear it if you don't own a copy. So that's just one of those things, when when you're in a band, you just lose control over certain things. Your recorded music being one of the first things you really lose control over. So, yeah, that album, we just don't, we don't know who owns it.
Well, thankfully, some of the songs from it live through the live sets, because as much as I love the classic 90s albums, I'm glad to see songs like Miss Disarray from 2010's No Chocolate Cake, as well as Break and Face the Dark from 2018's Mixed Reality, still living in the band's set lists, because as far as I'm concerned, across the decades, these are all vintage Gin Blossom songs. With so many fan favorites and obviously radio hits, it's a good problem to have, mind you. How do you guys strike a balance between the hit songs and the deeper cuts to kind of provide that live experience for any level of fandom?
Well, I'm the one that puts together the set lists, and we usually will reinvent the set like once a year, but we kind of know what works well in what sections. Like there's no doubt that the best way to start our show is with Follow You Down. So, I kind of space out the hits. I don't want to lose people's interest. So we got to make sure we're doing a recognizable hit song, like at least every 3 tunes or so. And for there to not be any giant stretches of the show, like 6 songs where the fans aren't hearing something that we are certain they're familiar with. So you kind of space the things out, and then through 1 or 2 shows, you can kind of figure out what songs work really well next to each other. And it's better to lead, have the 5th song be this one, and then the 6th song kick it off in this other direction. So it's just a balancing act of trying to satisfy the fans and also just present a cohesive set that flows really well. And as you said, it needs to represent the entire history of the band, and it has to be packed full of the familiar hit songs that we get hired to play. So I think the set we have right now is one of the best that we've ever had in terms of its flow and its momentum and how it represents the different stages of our career. So I'm enjoying the set as it is right now very much.
And people will be able to catch that set this summer when you're out on the road with Toad the Wet Sprocket. Is there going to be any new music in the set, or maybe some new music from the Gin Blossoms post tour on the horizon?
I hope so. I've begun negotiations with my bandmates to come up with a plan for us to make another record. I've got songs in the can that I'm ready to show the band, and I would like to record. And Jesse is always writing. He's always got songs ready to go. He's a very prolific songwriter. So I think we have material. It's really a matter of finding the time and the motivation. We had a conversation about it, and one of our members, when I said, well, let's make a record, he's like, why? What is the point? We go through all the effort to make the record, and then 2 years later, we're not even really doing any of those songs. Maybe 1 or 2 of them. You make 12 or 14 song record, and maybe 2 of them will end up in the set, and the rest of it's just kind of forgotten. So that was the point that he was trying to make. And I combated that by saying, I just think that it's an important part of being a band is to, from time to time, create new music, regardless of its commercial potential or how many people are going to hear it, just for what it means to me to be in a band and to be a songwriter and, to have this legacy. It's important to me that we continue to make new music, even if it's something that nobody ever hears. So we'll figure it out. As I said, I've just begun pressuring my bandmates to come up with a plan. So I would like to hope that within the next few months, we'll actually have a timeline for when we are going to be recording.
Well, Robin, this has been an absolute honor talking music with you tonight. Thank you so much for joining me on My Weekly Mixtape, man.
No, thank you. Thank you for having me. This has been fun and very cathartic. Yeah.
And to those listening, you can hear all the songs we talked about tonight in a playlist that's embedded over on the episode page at myweeklymixtape.com. There you can also hear the full catalog of My Weekly Mixtape episodes. And if you like what you're hearing on the show, you can help me out by either telling a friend, leaving the show a 5-star review wherever you're tuning in, or becoming a Patreon mixtaper at patreon.com/My Weekly Mixtape. There you can enjoy ad-free episodes of the show, become a future guest, chime in on future episode topics, and so much more. That's all for this week. Thanks again for listening, and until next time, enjoy the tunes.